The morning mist hung thick over the Colorado Rockies as Marcus Thompson adjusted his backpack straps and checked his compass one final time. The former Navy SEAL had been hiking these mountains for 15 years, ever since returning from his final deployment in Afghanistan. The wilderness had become his sanctuary, a place where the ghosts of war couldn't follow him into the peaceful silence of towering pines and crystal-clear streams. At 42, Marcus carried himself with the quiet confidence that came from surviving the impossible. His weathered hands bore scars from countless missions, and his steel-gray eyes held depths that spoke of things he'd rather forget. But out here, among the peaks and valleys of his beloved Colorado wilderness, he found the closest thing to peace his restless soul had known in decades. This particular November morning had started like any other. Marcus rose before dawn in his small cabin outside Boulder, brewed his usual black coffee, and studied the weather reports with the methodical precision that military training had drilled into him. A storm system was moving in from the west, but the forecast showed he had at least 6 hours before the first flakes would begin to fall. Plenty of time for his planned 12-mile loop through Glacier Ridge Trail. What Marcus didn't know was that 20 miles away, 2 women were preparing for what would become the most terrifying experience of their lives. Sarah Chun, a 28-year-old software engineer from Denver, had convinced her college roommate Jennifer Walsh to join her for what she described as an easy day hike, to celebrate Jennifer's recent promotion at her marketing firm. Sarah had been hiking for 3 years and considered herself experienced, though her definition of experience consisted mainly of well-marked trails and good weather with plenty of other hikers around. Jennifer, 26, and originally from Florida, had never hiked anything more challenging than the paved trails around city parks. But Sarah's enthusiasm was infectious, and Jennifer found herself agreeing to the adventure despite her complete lack of wilderness experience. The women met at Sarah's apartment at 8 in the morning, their excitement palpable as they loaded Jennifer's Honda Civic with what they thought was adequate gear. Sarah carried a small day pack with 2 water bottles, energy bars, and a lightweight jacket. Jennifer wore sneakers and brought nothing but her purse and a disposable camera she'd bought at a gas station. Neither woman checked the weather forecast, and neither had informed anyone of their specific hiking plans. Their destination was Bear Lake Trail, a popular route that Sarah had hiked twice before during the summer months. What she failed to realize was that winter hiking in the Colorado mountains was an entirely different beast than the leisurely summer walks she remembered. The trail conditions, weather patterns, and inherent risks multiplied exponentially once snow began to fall. They arrived at the trailhead parking lot around 10:30, spirits high, and chattering excitedly about the adventure ahead. A few other cars dotted the lot, giving them a false sense of security. Sarah pointed toward the trail marker, explaining to Jennifer that they would hike 3 miles to the lake, take some photos, and be back by mid-afternoon. The first mile went smoothly. The trail was well-defined, and despite the overcast sky, both women were enjoying themselves immensely. Jennifer marveled at the towering evergreens and crisp mountain air, while Sarah felt proud to be sharing one of her favorite activities with her best friend. They stopped frequently to take pictures, laughing and planning their next hiking adventure. But as they climbed higher, the temperature began to drop noticeably. What had started as a pleasant 50-degree morning was now hovering around 35 degrees, and the wind had picked up significantly. Sarah noticed the change, but convinced herself it was just the normal temperature variation that came with elevation gain. Jennifer, focused on keeping up and not wanting to appear weak, didn't mention that she was starting to feel cold in her light fleece jacket. By the time they reached the 2-mile mark, the first snowflakes were beginning to fall. Sarah looked at the sky with growing concern. This wasn't supposed to happen for hours yet. She pulled out her phone to check the updated weather forecast, only to discover she had no cell service. The mountain had swallowed their connection to the outside world. "Maybe we should head back," Jennifer suggested, her voice carrying a note of worry as she watched the snow begin to accumulate on the trail ahead of them. Sarah hesitated. They were so close to Bear Lake, and she'd promised Jennifer the spectacular views from the shoreline. Her pride as the experienced hiker in the group made the decision for her. "It's just a light snow," she said with more confidence than she felt. "We're only a mile from the lake. Let's at least make it that far. Then, we'll turn around." It was a decision that would haunt both women for the rest of their lives. The final mile to Bear Lake became a nightmare. The light snow transformed into a heavy, wet snowfall that reduced visibility to mere yards. The wind picked up to a howling crescendo that made communication difficult even when they were walking side by side. The well-marked trail disappeared under a blanket of white, and within 30 minutes of leaving the 2-mile marker, both women realized they were completely lost. Jennifer's sneakers, adequate for city sidewalks, provided no traction on the increasingly slippery trail. She fell 3 times in the space of 10 minutes, soaking her jeans and leaving her shivering uncontrollably. Sarah's hiking boots were better suited for the conditions, but her light jacket was no match for the storm that was rapidly developing into a full-scale blizzard. "We need to find shelter," Sarah shouted over the wind. Her earlier confidence completely evaporated. But in the swirling white chaos around them, shelter seemed like an impossible dream. Every direction looked identical, and the trail they had followed up the mountain had vanished completely. Meanwhile, 15 miles away, Marcus Thompson was experiencing the same sudden weather change from a very different perspective. His military training and years of mountain experience had taught him to read the subtle signs that preceded dangerous storms. The way the wind shifted, the particular quality of light that preceded heavy snowfall, the feeling in the air that spoke of trouble brewing. All these signals screamed at him to seek shelter immediately. Unlike the 2 women struggling to survive on Bear Lake Trail, Marcus was prepared. His pack contained emergency shelter, extra clothing layers, high-energy food, water purification tablets, a first aid kit, and, most importantly, years of experience in surviving adverse conditions. He also had something the women lacked: the wisdom to turn back when conditions deteriorated. Marcus found shelter in a shallow cave he'd discovered on a previous hike, settling in to wait out the storm with the patience that had kept him alive through multiple combat deployments. As he arranged his gear and prepared a hot meal on his portable stove, he couldn't shake the feeling that someone else might be caught unprepared in the rapidly developing blizzard. His instincts, honed by years of life and death situations, were rarely wrong. But even Marcus couldn't have imagined the desperate situation unfolding just miles away, where 2 women were discovering that the mountains showed no mercy to the unprepared. Sarah and Jennifer stumbled through the storm for another hour before admitting they were hopelessly lost. Jennifer's condition was deteriorating rapidly. Her wet clothes had robbed her body of precious heat, and her uncontrollable shivering had progressed to the point where she could barely speak coherently. Sarah wasn't much better off, though her hiking experience gave her a slight advantage in understanding their dire situation. They found minimal shelter beneath a cluster of large pine trees, but it provided little protection from the wind-driven snow. Sarah helped Jennifer sit down against the largest trunk and tried to think through their options with a mind that was becoming increasingly clouded by cold and fear. Their situation was desperate, and both women were beginning to understand that they might not survive the night. The temperature was plummeting, the storm showed no signs of abating, and they were completely unprepared for what was rapidly becoming a fight for their lives in one of nature's most unforgiving environments. As darkness began to fall early under the storm clouds, Marcus Thompson made a decision that would change 3 lives forever. Despite the dangerous conditions, something deep in his gut told him he needed to venture back out into the blizzard. Call it intuition, military instinct, or just the ingrained need to help others that had driven him to become a SEAL in the first place. He had no idea that his decision would lead him to 2 women who desperately needed a miracle, or that the rescue attempt would cost him more than he ever imagined possible. The stage was set for a story of survival, sacrifice, and the terrible price that heroes sometimes pay for doing what's right. The storm had been raging for 3 hours when Marcus Thompson made the decision that would define the rest of his life. Sitting in his makeshift shelter, he couldn't shake the nagging feeling that someone else was out there, unprepared and in serious danger. He'd learned long ago to trust these instincts. They had saved his life more times than he could count during his years of military service. Against every principle of wilderness survival he'd ever learned, Marcus packed up his shelter and ventured back into the blizzard. The wind hit him like a physical blow as he left the protection of the cave, driving snow into his face with such force that he had to navigate almost entirely by compass and memory. His plan was simple but dangerous. Make a wide sweep of the most popular trail areas, looking for signs of other hikers who might be caught unprepared. It was a long shot in the best of conditions, and in a full-scale blizzard, it bordered on suicidal. But Marcus had never been able to ignore the possibility that someone needed help, even if it meant putting his own life at risk. 5 miles away, Sarah and Jennifer were discovering just how quickly hypothermia could steal away human consciousness. Jennifer had stopped shivering an hour ago, which Sarah dimly recognized as a very bad sign from a wilderness first aid class she'd taken years earlier. Her friend's speech had become slurred and confused, and she kept trying to remove her jacket despite the freezing conditions. "I'm so warm," Jennifer mumbled, her words barely audible over the howling wind. "Why is it so hot in here?" Sarah knew enough to recognize the paradoxical undressing that marked severe hypothermia, but she was too cold and confused herself to do much about it. She managed to keep Jennifer's jacket on by holding her hands, but her own coordination was becoming increasingly poor. Simple tasks like opening her backpack or checking her phone had become monumentally difficult. The snow continued to pile up around them, and Sarah realized with growing horror that they were being slowly buried alive. Every few minutes, she had to brush snow off Jennifer's shoulders and head to keep her friend's airway clear. But her movements were becoming slower and more labored with each passing hour. As the afternoon wore on, both women drifted in and out of a dangerous twilight consciousness. Sarah would jolt awake every so often, panic flooding through her as she realized they were still trapped in the storm. She would shake Jennifer, trying to keep her friend awake, but it became increasingly difficult to rouse her. Jennifer's condition was deteriorating rapidly. Her breathing had become shallow and irregular, and her pulse was weak and erratic. She had stopped responding to Sarah's voice and seemed to be sinking into the deep, dangerous sleep that marked the final stages of severe hypothermia. Sarah knew they were dying. The knowledge came to her with crystalline clarity during one of her more lucid moments. They were going to freeze to death in these woods, and no one even knew where to look for them. She had been so casual about their hiking plans, so confident in her abilities, that she hadn't bothered to leave word with anyone about their specific route or expected return time. The guilt was almost worse than the cold. Jennifer had trusted her, had followed her lead into these mountains based on Sarah's assurances that it would be a safe, easy hike. Now her best friend was dying because of her poor judgment and overconfidence. Meanwhile, Marcus was fighting his own battle with the elements as he methodically searched the most likely areas where inexperienced hikers might venture. His military training kept him functional in conditions that would have incapacitated most people, but even he was being pushed to his limits. The snow was now falling so heavily that visibility was reduced to less than 10 feet. He had to rely entirely on his compass and his intimate knowledge of the mountain terrain to avoid walking off a cliff or into a ravine. Several times, he found himself momentarily disoriented, forced to stop, and carefully re-establish his position before continuing. Marcus had been searching for over an hour when he began to question the wisdom of his decision. The conditions were getting worse by the minute, and even with his extensive gear and experience, he was starting to feel the effects of the cold and exertion. His rational mind told him to find shelter and wait out the storm, but something deeper kept driving him forward. It was his training as a SEAL that ultimately saved 2 lives that day. Marcus had been taught to search methodically, to cover ground systematically even under the worst conditions. When he reached the area around Bear Lake Trail, he began working in a grid pattern, calling out every few yards despite the futility of trying to make his voice heard over the storm. He had been searching for 20 minutes when he almost walked past them entirely. If not for a small patch of bright blue fabric, part of Jennifer's jacket, barely visible under the accumulated snow, he might have missed them completely. At first, he thought he was looking at abandoned gear blown off the trail by the wind. Then, he saw movement. Marcus's heart lurched as he realized he was looking at 2 people, nearly buried under snow, huddled against a tree in what was clearly a desperate attempt to survive. He crashed through the snow drifts toward them, his exhaustion forgotten in the rush of adrenaline that came with finding survivors. The scene that greeted him was worse than he had feared. 2 young women, both severely hypothermic, one barely conscious, and the other completely unresponsive. They were soaked through, inadequately dressed for the conditions, and clearly in the final stages of freezing to death. "Hey," Marcus shouted, dropping to his knees beside them. "Can you hear me?" Sarah's eyes fluttered open, unfocused and confused. She tried to speak, but could only manage an unintelligible mumble. Jennifer didn't respond at all, her breathing so shallow that Marcus had to put his face close to hers to confirm she was still alive. Marcus's military medical training kicked in immediately. He assessed both women quickly, recognizing severe hypothermia in both cases, with Jennifer clearly in worse condition. They needed warmth, shelter, and medical attention, none of which were available on a mountainside in the middle of a blizzard. Working with practiced efficiency despite the brutal conditions, Marcus began setting up his emergency shelter. It was a lightweight tent designed for one person, but it would have to accommodate all three of them. As he worked, he kept talking to Sarah, trying to keep her conscious and aware. "What are your names?" he asked as he struggled to anchor the tent in the wind. Sarah," she managed through chattering teeth that had started working again as Marcus's presence gave her hope. "I'm Marcus. You're going to be okay, Sarah. Both of you. But I need you to help me get your friend into this shelter." Getting Jennifer into the tent was a nightmare. She was completely limp, unable to help in any way, and moving her through the snow while fighting the wind required every ounce of Marcus's strength. Sarah tried to help, but her coordination was so poor that she was more hindrance than assistance. Once inside the cramped shelter, Marcus faced a decision that would haunt him forever. Both women needed immediate rewarming to survive, but his resources were limited. He had one sleeping bag, one emergency bivvy, and his own body heat. Military survival training had taught him the most effective way to rewarm hypothermia victims, but it required direct skin-to-skin contact. Under normal circumstances, this would be a straightforward medical procedure. But Marcus was acutely aware that he was alone with two women who were barely conscious, unable to consent to the intimate contact that might save their lives. The ethical implications warred with the medical necessity, and precious minutes ticked by as he wrestled with the decision. Jennifer made the choice for him. Her breathing became even more labored, and Marcus realized she was slipping into cardiac arrest, the final stage before hypothermia became fatal. He stripped off his outer layers and pulled the unconscious woman against his body, using his own body heat to begin the slow process of rewarming her core temperature. Sarah, more aware of what was happening, tried to protest through her confusion. "What are you doing?" she mumbled, trying to pull Jennifer away from the stranger who had appeared out of the storm. "I'm trying to save her life," Marcus said gently but firmly. "This is a medical procedure, Sarah. Your friend is dying from hypothermia. I need to warm her up, or we're going to lose her." The next several hours passed in a blur of desperate medical intervention. Marcus used every technique he knew to slowly raise both women's core body temperature, monitoring their breathing and heart rates while fighting to keep the shelter intact against the battering wind. Slowly, incrementally, Jennifer's condition began to stabilize. Her breathing became deeper and more regular, and her skin began to feel warmer to the touch. Sarah responded more quickly, her military-trained rescuer helping her change into dry clothes from his pack and wrapping her in his emergency bivvy. But as the night wore on, Marcus began to realize the true cost of his rescue mission. In his haste to help the two women, he had given them his warm, dry clothing. His sleeping bag was now wet from Jennifer's soaked clothes, and his shelter was not designed to keep three people warm in blizzard conditions. Marcus was developing hypothermia himself. At first, he thought he could manage it. His physical conditioning was excellent, and he had survived cold weather conditions before. But as the hours passed, and he continued to give his resources to keep the women alive, his own core temperature began to drop dangerously. He didn't tell them what was happening. Sarah had recovered enough to be aware of their situation, and she was already racked with guilt over the mess they had gotten themselves into. Marcus didn't want to add to her psychological burden by letting her know that their rescuer was now in danger because of his efforts to save them. Instead, he continued to monitor both women, adjusting their positions, sharing his remaining food and water, and maintaining the shelter against the storm that continued to rage outside. All the while, his own condition quietly deteriorated. By dawn, when the storm finally began to subside, Marcus Thompson had saved 2 lives. But the cost of that salvation would prove to be higher than anyone could have imagined. The heroic Navy SEAL who had risked everything to save 2 strangers was about to face consequences that would change his life forever. The worst part was still to come. Dawn broke gray and silent over the Colorado mountains, the storm finally exhausting itself after more than 12 hours of relentless fury. Inside the cramped emergency shelter, 3 lives had been forever altered by the events of the previous night. Sarah Chun was awake, her mind finally clear enough to fully comprehend the magnitude of what had happened and what could have happened. Jennifer Walsh was alive, breathing steadily, her core temperature slowly returning to normal levels. The woman who had been knocking on death's door just hours earlier was now sleeping peacefully, wrapped in Marcus Thompson's sleeping bag, and slowly recovering from her brush with hypothermia. But Marcus himself was in trouble, though he tried desperately to hide it from the 2 women he had saved. The former Navy SEAL sat propped against the tent wall, his breathing shallow, and his movements carefully controlled. Throughout the long night, he had given away layer after layer of his own gear to keep Sarah and Jennifer alive. His jacket now covered Jennifer. His spare thermal underwear had been used to replace Sarah's wet clothing. His emergency bivvy had become Jennifer's extra insulation. Marcus was now wearing only a thin base layer and his hiking pants, both of which had become damp from the condensation inside the crowded shelter. His core temperature had dropped steadily through the night, but his military training had taught him to function even when his body was shutting down. Sarah noticed his condition first. As the morning light filtered through the tent walls, she could see that Marcus was shivering uncontrollably, his lips tinged blue with cold. When she looked closer, she realized his fingernails were also blue, and his skin had taken on a grayish pallor that terrified her. "Marcus," she said, her voice still hoarse from the ordeal. "You're freezing." "I'm fine," he replied automatically, though his words were slightly slurred. "How are you feeling? How's Jennifer?" Sarah wasn't fooled by his deflection. Even in her emotionally and physically drained state, she could see that their rescuer was now in serious medical distress. The man who had appeared out of the blizzard like some kind of guardian angel was suffering from the same condition that had nearly killed her and Jennifer. "You gave us all your gear," she said, the realization hitting her with crushing force. "You've been freezing all night while you kept us alive." Marcus tried to wave off her concern, but the movement was weak and unsteady. "It's temporary. Once we get moving and get some circulation going, I'll warm up." But Sarah could see that it wasn't that simple. Marcus had been sitting still for hours, using his body heat to warm Jennifer while the cold steadily sapped his strength. His sacrifice had been gradual but devastating, and now he was paying the price for his heroism. Jennifer stirred and slowly opened her eyes, confused and disoriented. "Where are we?" she asked, her voice weak but clear. "Safe," Sarah said quickly. "This is Marcus. He found us in the storm and saved our lives." Jennifer's eyes focused on Marcus, taking in his obvious distress. Even in her weakened state, she could see that something was seriously wrong with their rescuer. "You don't look good," she said with the blunt honesty of someone who had recently faced death herself. "We need to get out of here and get help," Sarah said, understanding dawning on her face. "All 3 of us need medical attention, but especially Marcus." The problem was that they were still miles from the trailhead, and the snow had transformed the mountain landscape into an alien world. The trail they had followed up was completely buried, and even Marcus's expert navigation skills would be severely tested in his current condition. Marcus tried to stand, and immediately swayed dangerously. Sarah caught his arm, alarmed by how cold his skin felt even through his thin shirt. He was hypothermic, possibly severely so, and his condition was likely to deteriorate rapidly once they left the relative shelter of the tent. "We can't let you lead us out," Sarah said firmly. "You can barely stand." "I know these mountains," Marcus insisted, though even he could hear the weakness in his own voice. "I can get us to safety." But as he tried to pack up his gear, his hands shook so violently that he couldn't manage the simple task of rolling up his sleeping bag. Sarah and Jennifer, despite their own weakness, had to take over the preparations for their descent. The three of them emerged from the tent into a world transformed by the storm. Snow lay 3 feet deep in most places, sculpted into fantastic drifts by the wind. The familiar landmarks that Marcus usually relied upon for navigation were completely obscured, and the temperature was still well below freezing. Marcus insisted on leading the way, using his compass and his knowledge of the mountain topography to choose their route. But within the first 100 yards, it became clear that he was in no condition to guide anyone to safety. He stumbled repeatedly in the deep snow, his coordination severely compromised by hypothermia. Sarah and Jennifer, despite having no wilderness experience beyond their disastrous hiking attempt, realized they had to take charge of their own rescue. Sarah took Marcus's compass and map, trying to make sense of the navigation tools while Jennifer did her best to support their weakening rescuer. The descent became a nightmare of endurance and determination. Marcus's condition continued to deteriorate as they struggled through the snow. He began to show signs of severe hypothermia, confusion, slurred speech, and dangerous disorientation. At one point, he insisted they were going the wrong direction and tried to lead them toward what Sarah was certain would be a dead end. "Marcus, you're not thinking clearly," Sarah said as gently as she could. "The hypothermia is affecting your judgment." But Marcus's military training made him resistant to accepting that his capabilities were compromised. He had been the leader, the rescuer, the expert who saved them from certain death. Admitting that he now needed their help went against every instinct that had kept him alive through years of dangerous missions. The role reversal was both heartbreaking and ironic. The two women who had been completely helpless just hours earlier were now struggling to save the man who had risked everything for them. Neither Sarah nor Jennifer had any medical training, but they did their best to monitor Marcus's condition and keep him moving towards safety. After 2 hours of difficult travel through the snow, they reached a point where Marcus could no longer continue. He collapsed in a drift, his body finally succumbing to the hypothermia that had been building throughout the night. His breathing became labored, and his skin took on the waxy appearance that indicated severe cold injury. "We have to get help," Jennifer said, panic creeping into her voice. "He's dying." Sarah pulled out her cell phone and was amazed to discover she had 1 bar of signal. With shaking hands, she dialed 911 and managed to reach emergency services. The conversation was difficult due to poor reception, but she was able to convey their approximate location and the nature of their emergency. The response was swift and professional. Within an hour, they could hear the sound of helicopters approaching, and soon after, a search and rescue team was making their way toward their location on snowshoes and skis. The paramedics who reached them first took one look at Marcus and immediately began emergency treatment for severe hypothermia. They wrapped him in special warming blankets, started 4 fluids, and prepared him for immediate evacuation to the nearest hospital. "Is he going to be okay?" Sarah asked one of the paramedics as they loaded Marcus into a rescue basket for helicopter transport. The paramedic's expression was grim. "He's in bad shape. Severe hypothermia, possible frostbite on his extremities. The next few hours will be critical." As the helicopter carrying Marcus disappeared over the mountain peaks, Sarah and Jennifer were left with their own rescue team for the hike out to safety. Both women were treated for mild hypothermia and exhaustion, but their injuries were minor compared to what had happened to their rescuer. During the long walk down to the trailhead, Sarah couldn't stop thinking about the sacrifice Marcus had made. He had literally given them the warmth from his own body to keep them alive, slowly freezing himself in the process. The magnitude of his selflessness was almost incomprehensible. "He didn't even know us," Jennifer said, voicing what they were both thinking. "He risked his life for 2 complete strangers." The rescue team leader, a grizzled mountain veteran named Pete, overheard their conversation. "That's Marcus Thompson," he said with obvious respect. "He's something of a legend around here. This isn't the first time he's risked himself to help others." "What do you mean?" Sarah asked. Pete adjusted his pack as they navigated a steep section of trail. "Marcus has been involved in at least a dozen rescues over the years. He knows these mountains better than almost anyone, and he's never been able to walk away when someone needed help. The problem is, he doesn't seem to value his own safety nearly enough." As they reached the parking lot where ambulances waited to transport Sarah and Jennifer to the hospital for evaluation, Both women were grappling with emotions they couldn't fully process. Guilt, gratitude, and a desperate concern for the man who had saved them warred in their minds. They had survived their ordeal, but the cost had been transferred to someone else. Marcus Thompson, the heroic Navy SEAL who had appeared out of a blizzard to save them, was now fighting for his life because he had chosen their survival over his own. The worst part was yet to come. As Sarah and Jennifer would soon learn, Marcus's injuries from that night on the mountain would prove to be far more devastating than anyone could have imagined. The price of heroism was about to become tragically clear. The intensive care unit at Denver Memorial Hospital was quiet except for the steady beeping of monitors and the soft hiss of ventilators. In room 314, Marcus Thompson lay unconscious, his body still fighting the effects of severe hypothermia that had nearly killed him on the mountain 3 days earlier. Sarah Chin sat in the uncomfortable visitor's chair beside his bed, her hands wrapped around a cup of coffee that had long since grown cold. She had been there for hours, watching the rise and fall of his chest, listening to the mechanical sounds that were keeping him alive. Jennifer Walsh entered the room quietly, carrying 2 fresh cups of coffee and wearing the haunted expression that had become familiar to both women since their rescue. The physical effects of their ordeal had been relatively minor, some frostbite on their fingers and toes, exhaustion, and dehydration. But the psychological impact of what had happened was devastating. "Any change?" Jennifer asked, settling into the chair on the other side of Marcus's bed. Sarah shook her head. "The doctor came by an hour ago. He's still critical, but stable. The hypothermia caused some heart rhythm problems, and they're worried about kidney damage." The 2 women sat in silence, both consumed by guilt that had been eating at them since the rescue. They had learned more about Marcus Thompson over the past few days, and each new piece of information made their burden heavier. Dr. Patricia Martinez, the physician overseeing Marcus's care, had explained the full extent of his injuries with clinical precision that somehow made them even more heartbreaking. Severe hypothermia with core body temperature below 85 degrees when he arrived, she had told them. Frostbite on all fingers and toes, some of it severe enough to require surgical intervention. Kidney damage from the cold exposure. Cardiac arrhythmia that we're still trying to stabilize. But it was what Dr. Martinez said next that had shattered both women completely. "The preliminary tests suggest there may be some neurological damage as well," she had explained gently. "When the brain is exposed to extreme cold for extended periods, it can cause lasting effects. We won't know the full extent until he wakes up, but you should prepare yourselves for the possibility that he may not be the same person who went into those mountains." Sarah had spent the last 3 days researching hypothermia and its long-term effects on the internet, each article she read adding to her crushing sense of responsibility. She had learned about the potential for memory loss, cognitive impairment, personality changes, and physical disabilities that could result from severe cold injury. The man who had saved their lives might never be whole again because of their poor decisions. Jennifer had thrown herself into learning everything she could about Marcus Thompson himself. What she discovered painted a picture of a man who had dedicated his life to serving others, often at significant personal cost. Marcus had joined the Navy at 18, driven by a desire to make a difference in the world. He had excelled in SEAL training and served with distinction in Afghanistan and Iraq, earning multiple commendations for valor and several Purple Hearts for wounds received in combat. After leaving the military, he had worked as a wilderness guide and search and rescue volunteer, using his skills to help others navigate the mountains he loved. Pete, the rescue team leader, had provided Jennifer with stories of Marcus's heroism that went back years. Hikers pulled from avalanches, climbers rescued from impossible situations, lost children found, and returned to their families. He never asked for recognition, Pete had told her. Marcus just showed up when people needed help, did what needed to be done, and disappeared back into the mountains. He saved more lives than most people will ever know about. Now that same hero lay unconscious in a hospital bed, his life forever altered because he couldn't walk away when 2 strangers needed help. On the 4th day, Marcus finally began to show signs of consciousness. Sarah was alone in the room when his eyes fluttered open, unfocused, and confused. She immediately pressed the call button for the nursing staff while trying to speak to him calmly. "Marcus? Can you hear me? You're in the hospital. You're safe." His eyes moved toward her voice, but there was no recognition in them. He tried to speak, but only managed a weak croak. Sarah offered him some ice chips, her hands shaking as she helped him take small sips of water. Dr. Martinez arrived within minutes, followed by a team of specialists. Sarah was asked to step outside while they conducted their neurological assessment, and she found herself pacing the hallway with the anxiety that bordered on panic. Jennifer arrived just as the medical team was finishing their evaluation. The two women waited together in agony as Dr. Martinez reviewed her notes and conferred with the other physicians. When Dr. Martinez finally emerged from Marcus's room, her expression was carefully neutral. "He's awake and responsive," she began, and both women felt a surge of hope. "His vital signs are improving, and the kidney function is better than we expected." "But?" Sarah asked, sensing there was more. Dr. Martinez paused, choosing her words carefully. "There appears to be some cognitive impairment. His short-term memory is significantly affected, and he's showing signs of confusion and disorientation. It's too early to know if these effects will be permanent, but—" She didn't need to finish the sentence. Both women understood that Marcus might never fully recover from the brain damage caused by his prolonged exposure to extreme cold. Over the following weeks, as Marcus slowly recovered his physical strength, the extent of his neurological damage became heartbreakingly clear. He had lost most of his memories from the year before the rescue, including all memory of that night on the mountain. He couldn't remember saving Sarah, and Jennifer couldn't recall the decision that had led him back into the storm to search for survivors. More devastating still, his personality had changed in subtle but profound ways. The confident, capable man who had spent his life helping others was now uncertain and anxious. Simple tasks that had once been second nature, reading maps, planning hiking routes, making quick decisions under pressure, had become difficult or impossible. His fingers, damaged by severe frostbite, would never regain full dexterity. The career as a wilderness guide was over. His days as a search and rescue volunteer were finished. The mountains that had been his sanctuary were no longer safe for him to navigate alone. Sarah and Jennifer visited him regularly as he went through months of rehabilitation. They watched him struggle through physical therapy, speech therapy, and occupational therapy, slowly relearning skills that had been stolen by the cold. Marcus was always polite to them, but there was no recognition in his eyes. He knew they were the women he had supposedly rescued, but he had no memory of the experience. To him, they were just two strangers who visited him in the hospital and seemed unusually concerned about his welfare. "I wish I could remember," he told them one afternoon as they sat in the rehabilitation center's common room. "Everyone keeps telling me I was a hero that night, but I can't recall any of it. It's like it happened to someone else." The irony was crushing. The man who had sacrificed everything to save them couldn't even remember why he had done it. His heroism had been wiped away along with so much else, leaving only the devastating consequences. As the months passed, it became clear that Marcus would need ongoing care and support. His military disability benefits provided basic coverage, but the specialized treatment he required was expensive. His small savings were quickly exhausted by medical bills and the cost of adapting his home for his new limitations. Sarah and Jennifer quietly began organizing fundraising efforts to help cover his expenses. They reached out to veterans organizations, started a crowdfunding campaign, and contacted local businesses for support. It was the least they could do for the man who had given up so much for them. But money couldn't restore what Marcus had lost. His independence was gone. His career was over. His cognitive abilities were permanently diminished. The sharp, capable mind that had kept him alive through multiple combat deployments and dangerous rescues had been damaged beyond repair. The most heartbreaking moment came 6 months after the rescue, when Marcus was finally able to return to his cabin in the mountains. Sarah and Jennifer drove him home from the rehabilitation center, helping him carry his few belongings back into the house where his adventure had begun. Marcus stood in his living room, looking around at the familiar space with the expression of someone visiting a place they had heard about but never seen. The maps on his walls, the hiking gear carefully organized in closets, the photos of mountain peaks he had climbed, none of it triggered any memories. "I must have really loved these mountains," he said quietly, looking at a framed photograph of himself at the summit of a 14er. "You did," Sarah replied, her voice barely above a whisper. You said they were your sanctuary. Marcus nodded slowly, accepting this information about himself like he accepted all the other details of his life that had been erased. He had been told he was a hero, a skilled mountaineer, a man who dedicated his life to helping others. But these were just stories to him now, tales about a stranger who happened to share his name. As they prepared to leave him alone in his cabin for the first time since the rescue, both women struggled with the enormity of what had transpired. They were alive because Marcus Thompson had risked everything to save them. But the cost of their survival had been the destruction of the man who had rescued them. Thank you, Jennifer said as they stood at his door, knowing the words were inadequate, but needing to say them anyway. Marcus smiled, a different smile than the confident grin he had worn in his old photographs. Gentler, but somehow sadder. You're welcome, he said. I just wish I could remember what I'm being thanked for. As they drove away from the cabin, both women were crying. Behind them, Marcus Thompson stood in his doorway, a hero who had saved 2 lives and lost himself in the process. The mountains stretched out before him, beautiful and dangerous and now forever beyond his reach. The story had ended with everyone alive, but the true cost of that survival would echo through 3 lives forever. Sometimes the price of heroism is higher than anyone should have to pay, and sometimes the people who pay it don't even remember why they chose to sacrifice so much. Marcus Thompson had given everything to save 2 strangers in a blizzard. In return, he had lost himself completely, becoming a stranger even to his own memories. It was the kind of tragedy that makes heroes seem both blessed and cursed, capable of extraordinary goodness but destined to bear the weight of their own nobility.